Yes, I should start by saying that I was volunteered for this job whilst I was actually visiting my family in Ghana. But that seems very apposite really, because my interest in this subject stems from doing family history research. And I was interested in what my two grandfathers were doing during World War I. My maternal grandfather was a Cornishman who lied about his age and enlisted. Thousands of miles away, my paternal grandfather, in what was then called the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, was a merchant who had to sell supplies to the troops, the Allied troops, in the campaigns that were undertaken in World War I. So my interest was very much about the voices, African voices, in terms of what impact the war had had on them. Another trigger was the fact that I was involved in working with some asylum seekers and refugees here in Bristol. They were putting together their digital stories for the exhibition here at the N-Shed called Moved by Conflict back in 2014. And the idea was that they were telling their stories about why they'd had to move to Bristol because of the conflicts in their countries. But in helping them do the stories, I discovered a lot of them came from African countries that had in fact been involved in World War I. And the members of the Welcome Centre said they'd never learnt this at school, they didn't know this. So from those two aspects, this is what's really brought my interest in the subject. And I've called it Black Lives in a White Man's War because my interest is very much on African voices, because little is written, and even less from an African perspective, of World War I in Africa. My talk doesn't pretend to be comprehensive, so gaps are inevitable, but as I said, my interest is very much focused on the voices of Africans. But let's start with the background. In terms of the background context, could I ask you to move to Scramble for Africa?
Done it. Oh, Scramble for Africa.
Thank
okay.
you.
Yeah. And we have to skip through the slides to get to the one. One here? Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know how clear it is. But basically, Africa became involved in World War I because most of the continent was under the European imperial control. And in particular, in sub-Saharan Africa, every country except Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia, and Liberia were protectorates and colonies of various European powers. And the 19th century had been very much a century whereby the European powers had been involved in carving up Africa for themselves in what's become known as the Scramble for Africa. And Germany was a latecomer, but at the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885, Germany ensured that it had its place in the sun and had some of the colonies as part of the formal agreements made at that conference. And the colonies were Togoland and Cameroon in West Africa, German East Africa, which then was Tanganyika, Rwanda and Burundi, today's Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi. And in terms of the scramble for Africa, at that time, over many years during the 19th century, the European powers had been involved in invasions, expeditions, wars over getting these colonies in Africa. And it's noteworthy for me the number of British and French military generals of the First World War who in fact had built their careers in empire building in Africa as well as India. So in terms of the invasions and the wars, David Olusoga said, the colonies, and particularly those in Africa, were in the late 19th century regarded by the more optimistic observers as Europe's safety valve, an arena in which international tensions might be diffused, thereby avoiding the risk of confrontation breaking out between the great powers in Europe itself. By 1914, however, although European rivalries persisted, there was a common desire to exploit rather than fight over and devastate their African colonies, and a common determination to safeguard racial prestige, which was being fostered in terms of white superiority. So there was an increasing rapprochement in Africa amongst the European colonial powers. However, initially when war broke out, the European powers sought to avoid war in Africa. Neither Britain nor Germany were on a war footing. Many white people, both in Europe and the white settlers in Africa, believed that if the white men now fought one another in front of Africans, the result would be to tarnish the white man's image or prestige and lead Africans to question why they should obey their colonial masters. In addition, colonial ministers in Europe and the white settlers in Africa feared that the economic advances that were being made in Africa could be reversed by war. In reality, war was inevitable in Africa. Despite the pressing need for military victories over the Central Powers in Europe, imperial rivalries and colonial aspirations would remain significant factors throughout World War I. On the 5th of August 1914, the British Committee of Imperial Defence met in London to discuss plans for the conquest of Germany's colonial empire. At the same time, Germany coveted French and Belgian colonies in Central Africa because it would give them a broad belt across the middle part of Africa as their colonial preserve. Is it any wonder, therefore, that the African-American thinker and journalist W.E.B. Du Bois argued the case for the African roots of war? He insisted that the war was primarily a competition for Africa's resources, the inevitable war of empire. In his editorial, World War I and the Colour Line, he wrote of, quote, civilized nations fighting like mad dogs over the right to own and exploit these darker peoples. However, on the outbreak of war, with few exceptions, there was a wave of pro-British and pro-imperial sentiment amongst African educated elite. This was partly in the hope that such loyalty would result in greater political and economic progress on their part after the war was over. And several of the British West African newspapers strongly supported the British war effort. In the Gold Coast in Ghana, Casely Hayford, who was the editor of the Gold Coast Leader, was primarily a prime force also in initiating war and relief funds on behalf of the British for the war effort. And it's noteworthy that the Governor Clifford, who was the governor of the Gold Coast at the time, said on the 28th of October 1918, "It is worthy of note that during the war, 11 aeroplanes were presented to the British government by the people of the Gold Coast."
Which one do we want?
That's the one.
That one, okay.
So, the immediate consequence for Africa of the declaration of World War I in Europe was the invasion by the Allies of Germany's African colonies. The campaigns in Africa were in two distinct phases. The Allies were keen to knock out Germany's offensive capability and ensure that her fleet, Germany's fleet, could not use her African ports to access coal and provisions. The Allies also wanted to silence the German radio stations, which were a major means of communication for the German military. However, the second phase was about the conquest of German colonies in Africa, both to prevent them from being used as bases for the subversion of the Allies' often tenuous authority in their own colonies, and to share them amongst themselves in the event of an overall Allied victory. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go into detail with the 4 campaigns, but I just wanted to touch on 1 or 2 points. In Togoland, the importance of Togoland was that it was the first British shot of World War I on land. Contrary to popular belief, the first British shot was in Africa, not in Europe. And it was by a member of a soldier in the Gold Coast Regiment. The Togoland campaign was short, but the costs were borne totally by the Gold Coast, not the British authorities. The other campaign in West Africa was the Cameroons. And I'd like to read a personal reflection on the impact of this war on one of the Africans in the Cameroons. He said, "The First World War made a bad impression on the Beti." They're a particular tribe in Cameroon. "People spoke with horror of the white man's war. They'd never seen anything like it. Their own wars involved only a few people over short periods of time and were consequently less destructive." A longer campaign was fought in German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia. When war broke out in 1914, Botha, the Prime Minister of South Africa, cabled London to say that the newly formed South Africa Defence Force would protect South Africa. The British authorities accepted this offer and asked the South Africans if they could, quote, "seize such parts of German Southwest Africa as would give them command of the ports and wireless stations there, or in the interior, as it would be," I quote, "a great and urgent imperial service." From the start of the war, the South African government deliberately planned to limit black South African involvement. They focused on using them purely as carriers of cheap labour. There was a determined refusal to employ Africans as soldiers. Botha proudly boasted the colours had nothing to do with this war between the Germans and the South Africans. However, there were other Africans involved in that campaign, but most of them were conscripted soldiers who participated on behalf of the Portuguese in what was Portuguese West Africa, Angola, because the Germans were raiding over the border into Portuguese West Africa. The final campaign, in German East Africa, was the longest campaign of the war, and much more has been written about this particular campaign, more than any other aspect of Africa's involvement in World War I. Partly, I think, because the campaign reads like a boy's own story. Men battled with the terrain, the climate, diseases, starvation. Insects played their part too, as the tsetse fly amongst animals and mosquitoes amongst people caused great sickness and death. Even the Battle of Tanga in 1914 was known as the Battle of the Bees, because there were swarms of bees that flew over both continents. This is a personal interest, local interest, because the campaign in German East Africa started with the German cruiser, the Colonial, sinking one of the British ships, HMS Pegasus, in the Zanzibar harbour in 1914. And there was a report in the Chew Valley and Rincton Vale Gazette about this incident, because George Bronca was a seaman, a sailor, on this particular ship, and he was wounded but not killed in that incident. Moving on, this campaign was a campaign that was remembered, I think, a lot to do with this particular German commander, Lieutenant Vorbeck. He had a deliberate strategy of encouraging the British forces to attack with as many men as possible, in the belief that this Allied forces would be not deployed in Europe, so be starving Europe of Allied soldiers. But the campaign, from a British point of view, did not go well. And by 1915, Britain wanted the soldiers to conquer German East Africa with as little delay as possible. This gentleman prevented that happening. And the conflict became known as, by William Boyd, as the Ice Cream War, because German forces would melt away whenever threatened by their British opponents. Increasingly, in this campaign, by 1916, more and more black soldiers and black carriers were used by both sides. Even a British West Indies battalion were ordered to East Africa.
Excuse me, Mr.
Not by any means.
Could someone go next door and find out what's happening?
I'm really getting a very good sort of mixture of people from universities.
Can I carry on?
Colleagues of those of one sort of
There's happened earlier
from
on
sort of
stop, because the person speaking next door.
ordinary working class people talking about
Can you all hear me if I keep going?
stage as the agents of this.
Yes.
Okay.
Other people then asking them questions.
In this particular field of World War I in Africa, all the campaigns relied on African carriers, porters, who were carrying on their heads and shoulders military equipment, supplies, food, especially where there was no infrastructure like roads or railways.
But actually, not too far, I don't remember.
Whilst the majority of the carriers were men, there were some women and children, and a number of Ascari African soldiers, as well as carriers, took their wives and children with them.
Around a general interest in
By 1918, the last battle of the war in World War I was fought
of working people
in
from this stream.
Africa by the German Ascari and 750 men of the King's African Rifles.
Yeah, I mean it was.
On the 25th of November, that's a fortnight after the armistice in Europe, the Germans surrendered to the British forces in what was then Northern Rhodesia, but today is called Zambia. Africans were not just involved in Africa. They were recruited and later forcibly conscripted to serve on the battlefields of Europe. The French put its Algerian, Moroccan and West African troops into the trenches from 1914 onwards. And by 1918, the November 1918, the French armies in Europe were in large part made up of colonial battalions, mostly drawn from Africa. And these troops participated in the most important battles during every phase of the war. For many Africans, the journey from Africa to Europe was a journey beyond the bounds of their knowledge. Most had never before left their villages and few had seen the ocean. Candé Camara's account of the sea voyage from Guinea to France is one of the few oral accounts that tells us about the impact of the war on Africans. He said, "The doctors on the ship were constantly occupied curing the sick, and there were all kinds of illness, even psychological illness, because people didn't know where they were going or even why they were fighting." There were images too. The conditions apparently were very, very bad on these ships, and some people said it was reminiscent of the Middle Passage during the slave trade period. So whilst the French employed a lot of black soldiers, this is a poster of their famous colonial troops that were on the front line in France and Belgium. The British recruited thousands of Africans to serve in Europe, but never permitted them to be fighting in a combatant role. In summer 1916, in the weeks following the Battle of the Somme, demands were made that the British Empire emulate the French, i.e. conscript in Africa. The most influential voice for the policy in 1916 was Winston Churchill. In May 1916, he argued in the House of Commons that a force of Africans be recruited and deployed in Europe. He said, "Let us think what historians of the future would write if they were writing a history of the present time and had to record that Great Britain was forced to make an inconclusive peace because she forgot Africa. That at a time when every man counted, the government of Great Britain was unable to make use of a mighty continent." In 1916, the South African government agreed to recruit a Cape-coloured Labour battalion. Over 1,000 enlisted black soldiers, commanded by white South African officers, were to serve in France under the imperial, not the South African command. As enlisted soldiers, this battalion was known as the Cape Boys, and they were allowed the same level of freedom as British soldiers. However, a Labour contingent called the South African Native Labour Contingent was also recruited in 1916, but the South African government stipulated that the men should be segregated and housed within a closed compound. Berta's list of conditions was intended to prevent them gaining any significant access to European society, especially access to white women, or developing any ideas that their service and sacrifice would lead to any change or improvement in their material conditions or political status back home in South Africa. Some of you may know about this particular Labour battalion because on February 21st, 1917, the tragedy of the SS Mende occurred. The majority of the ship's passengers were members of this particular Labour contingent. 802 were natives from South Africa. En route from Plymouth to France, the ship was struck by another ship, the Darrow, off the Isle of Wight, and 607 of the 802 natives died, and their bodies recovered, or the men that were able to get to land but died afterwards. They're buried in Britain, France and Holland. But two of the casualties are based in Arnes Vale Cemetery in Bristol, both of them having died in Bristol hospitals. I said that there was an initial amongst the African educated elite a pro-British, pro-imperial sentiment supporting the British war effort, but there was resistance. The World War I period saw African resistance in most parts of the continent, and resistance took a number of forms ranging from passive resistance to active revolt and rebellion. And there were some current themes underlying this resistance. The main one being resentment against wartime measures such as wartime taxation, but particularly huge resentment against compulsory recruitment, i.e. forced conscription of labour. With some chiefs, willingly or not, attempted to meet recruitment quotas. Others, risking various forms of punishment, refused to send men to the British. This was particularly evident in some parts of Nigeria. A first-hand account of what it was like to be recruited, as told by a carrier who was recruited in 1914, shows how misleading the term voluntary recruitment was. He said, "We came back one night from our yam farm. The chief called us and handed us over to a government messenger. I didn't know where we were going, but the chief and the messenger said that the white men had sent for us and we must go. After 3 days, we reached the white man's compound. Plenty of others had arrived from other villages far away. And the white man wrote our names in a book and tied a brass-numbered ticket around our necks and gave each man a blanket and food. Then he told us we were going to the Great War to help the king's soldiers who were preventing Germans coming to our country and burning it. We left and marched far into the bush. The government police led the way and allowed no man to stop behind. As war progressed, there was insufficient Africans who were voluntarily recruiting. So in 1915, the Native Followers Recruitment Ordinance opened the way for compulsory service. This law allowed for the compulsory recruitment of men from across British-ruled Africa to work as carriers. This act pushed thousands of men to attempt to escape military service. They left their villages, ran into the bush, headed to the cities, or even crossed borders into neighbouring countries. Resistance to forced recruitment was not always passive. In 1914 to 1915, there was a rebellion in northern Nigeria because peasants feared that the army was going to conscript them in large numbers. Different tribes in British East Africa also rose in revolt against the British persistent tax and labour demands. In 1915, one particular rebellion in Nyasaland, today's Malawi, caused serious alarm amongst British authorities. An American-trained missionary called John Chilembre led an uprising. It was religious as well as anti-colonial in character, but most importantly, it was triggered by a high level of forced military recruitment of Nyasas, many of whom were subsequently killed in large numbers in the first weeks of fighting. In November 1914, Chilembe wrote, I quote, "The poor Africans who have nothing to own in this present world are invited to die for a cause which is not theirs." He also wrote a letter to the Nyasa Times, asking that Africans who do not know the cause of your fight should not be conscripted to fight in a British civilised war. Let the rich men, bankers, titled men, storekeepers and landlords go to war and get shot rather than Africans. His appeal was not published. This particular rebellion was very important in African memory because it's seen as one of the liberation ideologies of the early liberation ideologies of Black Africa. There were two rebellions in Portuguese East Africa, current-day Mozambique, and they were set off by wartime service demands too. So although these rebellions had origins in more fundamental concerns about colonial rule, it was World War I, and in particular wartime conscription, which focused grievances and led to active resistance. Those who were enlisted there was excessive desertion rates amongst them. Many soldiers and carriers adopted passive resistance techniques, like hiding in the bush, malingering, discarding loads, feigning sickness. I don't think many of them would have to feign sickness. There was huge sickness in these campaigns. Or purposely misunderstanding orders. There was also African resistance amongst German forces, although the Germans in German East Africa claimed that not a single tribe rose against our rule during the war. Nowhere was it necessary to divert a single squad to keep down rebellions. This wasn't true. Rebellions simmered in the Macondi Highlands in the southeast of the colony right through until 1917, and there was unrest in many other parts of the colony. Resistance was also in reaction to the economic hardships caused by the war, because for many, being conscripted meant serving in an army who paid very much less than civilian jobs in the mines or in the railways and public works. There was discontent with particular aspects of the colonial system. The French, as I said, who did conscript a huge number of African troops. There was armed resistance against the recruiters, who were often African intermediaries in French West Africa during 1915 and 1916. By 1917, French colonial troops were dying in great numbers in Europe on the Western Front because they were deliberately being used as cannon fodder. They were placed in the first waves of attack and were set very difficult military objectives. This was done to reduce the casualty rates amongst white French units. So by 1917, the French authorities stopped recruitment in French West Africa for fear of a serious revolt. There was also religious reasons for resistance. African Muslims resisted military service because they believed that fighting meant killing their Muslim brothers, either in Africa or in other theatres of war like the Middle East. In the central region of Nyasaland, a secret religious group known as the Nyal became the focal point for successful resistance to forced military labour. Now I come to the major impact of the war and its aftermath. The war had social, economic and political impact on Africans and the continent, both during and after the war. Not surprisingly, the biggest impact was the human cost of the war. 2 million Africans were dragged into the war, but the numbers who died is not known. No complete record exists of the African soldiers who died, nor is there any record of the carriers who died. One colonial official admitted that the British record in East Africa, quote, only stopped short of scandal because the people who suffered most were the carriers. And after all, who cares about native carriers? By some estimates, 1 million Africans died directly or indirectly as a consequence of World War I. There were also hundreds of thousands who were left with long-term physical and mental ill health and who returned to civilian life with poor prospects for obtaining employment. And not all Africans returned to their homes after the war ceased. African regiments served in the armies of occupation not only in former German colonies, but also in Mesopotamia, the Rhineland, Hungary, Bulgaria and Turkey. Although it wasn't a result of the war, the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 came at a time when the authorities were distracted by war. African responses to this pandemic vary. However, in oral accounts, one phrase is very common. It says, there came a darkness. 1.5 to 2 million Africans were estimated in sub-Saharan Africa to have died from this pandemic by the time it was over. It was spread through the routes of war, with soldiers and carriers returning home. One of the big aspects was the psychological impact on war. Many of the Ascari and carriers returned to their tribes and villages with changed ideas. Their experiences led them to challenge some of the traditions and customs, because travel overseas, contact with people from other countries and cultures, had helped them gain new perceptions of themselves and others. One black South African said the most amazing aspect of his experience as a labourer in France was, I quote, to see the different kinds of human races from all parts of the world. Crucially, fighting, killing and dying alongside Europeans, Africans discovered that there was little difference between themselves and white men. European racial superiority was dented as Africans were able to see their imperial rulers in ways that would never have been possible or even permissible under normal circumstances. The social fabric of hundreds of communities was torn apart because millions were affected by the fighting, their crops were seized, their men conscripted by force and taken from their communities, leaving families struggling to plant and harvest their crops. Famine and its attendant diseases broke out in East Africa in late 1917 and 1918. And a village headman in Nyasaland wrote to the Chief Secretary in 1917 to say, now this war has lasted perhaps 3 years and many men are dying. So we're wondering, when will the war end? Because the women are alone and there is hunger in our villages. Wartime destruction and dislocation also had serious ecological consequences as populations moved, the tsetse fly spread, and the Germans had a scorched earth policy, so a lot of the land was devastated as they retreated. There were economic effects in terms of World War I, generally negative effects on trade and development in Africa. Most Africans were economically worse off at the end of the war than at the beginning. In most colonies, the war increased taxation and decreased development expenditure on public works like railways, on buildings for social welfare like schools and hospitals. Also, as a large number of Europeans went off to fight in Europe from living in Africa, more Africans were moved into their jobs. However, on the end of war and the Europeans coming back, most of these Africans were demoted. The key impact was political. At the peace conference in 1919, Germany was forced to give up her colonies in Africa, but there was no serious discussion of political freedom for the peoples living in those countries. Under the article of the 119 of Treaty of Versailles, it was agreed that as these were, I quote, peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, there should be applied the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples form a sacred trust of civilization. Beneath the legalistic jargon of the mandate system, Africans of former German colonies found themselves and their lands transferred to the empires of the victorious powers. Few Africans gained any reward for their loyalty, and Jomo Kenyatta wrote bitterly in his autobiography, Facing Mount Kenya, that the only reward for taking part was the taking away of our best lands from the Africans. The introduction of Kipande with its diabolical system of fingerprints, as though the Africans were criminals. Imposition of heavy taxation and denial of freedom through the continuation of labour conscription. However, the war did encourage nationalist ideas and stimulated ambitions amongst some African educated elites to gain greater political and social equality within their own countries. Despite the contribution of black people in World War I, there was no single African delegate at the peace conference. So the Pan-African Conference held in Paris in 1919 coincided deliberately with the Versailles Peace Conference. And this Congress called for Africa to be granted home rule and for Africans to take part in governing their countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, small elite groups such as the South African National Congress, Native National Congress, and the British National Congress of British West Africa lobbied the London government, the British government, for political reform in 1919 and 1920. Could I ask for the next slide?
Another slide, yes. There we are.
This slide, don't think you can see it very well, but in part of my family research, family history research, I found out that the National Congress of British West Africa, who lobbied the British government in 1920, contained members of my family. In conclusion, in this conflict that wasn't their own, the people, resources and materials of Africa were mobilised by the colonial powers for the European war effort. These campaigns were often termed as sideshows in comparison to what was seen as the main show going on in Europe. However, Africans living in all parts of the continent were affected and had a great impact, as I said, both socially, economically and politically by World War I and its aftermath. Sadly, by the end of the war, the Africans were to remain subject peoples in positions still of inequality and subordination, in what might be seen as the final phase of the scramble for Africa. However, an increasing number of Africans had learnt a valuable lesson, that a war in which Europeans slaughtered fellow Europeans meant that colonial regimes had little right to lecture Africans about how to conduct their affairs.
Thanks, There are lots of fascinating stuff. Are there any questions on what Dylan said or perhaps that she hasn't said as well?
It's not
Anyone to ask anything? Mike?
I just sort of a very informative and very presentation on a little about. One thing that struck me, I wondered whether there was how much fear there was of arming Africans on the first hand, and on the second hand, how much of this, when Africans came out of the war, would they have taken their weapons with them? And I'm thinking, of course, this consciousness coming around about
exactly. I think a very good question. I don't know, because it took quite a while to demobilise after the war ended. And a number, as I said, of Africans were still serving in different areas. So I don't think it's known, but it would be very interesting to know how much as a result of that wartime experience that, as you said, that the black Africans were able to take their weapons, but also in terms of getting together, in terms of subsequent, because there were there was more industrial unrest after World War One rather than open revolts using weapons. So I don't know, but it'd be very interesting. Because one of the issues too was that the German forces, they used, as you know, a lot of Africans, but they gave them very old weapons.
So there was a fear.
And so, particularly in German East Africa, because of the length of the campaign, Letterforbeck was very, very keen to get hold of British ammunition and guns because they were more modern. So I would also wonder how many were killed even by using some of the weapons. I don't know. But yes, an interesting point.
More questions? I'll ask one on that. Is it the case that in East Africa, where the war moved up and down
Yes.
the third country, that the same Africans were recruited to both the British and German armies? So
Yes, that's very true. And one account I saw of an Ascari where they were, the German Ascari were captured by the British, and the British said, come and fight for us. And the German Ascari said, well, how much are you paying? And the British said how much they were paying, and the German Ascari said, oh, we get more than that in the German forces, so no, we're not going to come. But the British then said, well, we're not going to give you any food, we're going to capture you, but we're not going to feed you or give you anything to keep you going. So in the end, this German Ascari said, we were forced to fight. Although I suspect there was huge desertions in terms of both sides. But because of the length of the campaign, at one point, Letterforbeck gathered his troops together and said, only the fittest of you are going to continue careering round the whole of East Africa on this campaign. And because due to sickness, a lot of it was sickness, he said, you'll stay and I'll leave the British to look after you, and only the fittest will come with me. And a number of the Ascari, and he sent the women, the wives and children who were with the Ascari, he sent them back and said, no, you've got to stay behind and the British will look after you as well. And apparently the fit forces continued on with the campaign, only to find that the women and children came and said, no, we're not going to be left behind, we're going to stay with our men. But as you said, partly because they were going in all directions. We don't hear so much about British ones going over to the Germans, but we hear a lot more about the German Ascari going over to the British.
Thanks.